After gaining control of the Italian peninsula, Rome began to expand its influence around the Mediterranean. This expansion caused conflict within the Roman society, which eventually crushed the Republic. But the results of the Roman Empire. The Italian peninsula was basically conquered by 264 BC, and that was right before the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars, fought by Carthage and Rome, added when the Italians won the Punic Wars, they gained the territories here and in Spain, so the Eastern Europe, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and Spain, and then Sardinia and Sicily and parts of North Africa. But then Caesar came along in 44 or the 40s BC, and he added, through his own conquest, this area that is called Gaul, which is today parts of France and a little bit of Switzerland here. And then he also added the North African coastline along here, and through his relationship with Cleopatra, who owned all of Egypt, he brought Egypt into the fold of the Roman Empire. Also, right after his death, there was a civil war, and these areas here and this area here were also added to the Roman Empire. The problem with creating an empire is that they didn't have the political structure to rule an empire. They had a political structure that was perfect for a small group of people that ruled a small area. So to have this much territory as part of their under their control, they just didn't have the structuring or the political structuring for that type of government, and it caused a lot of problems. And people saw that there were a lot of problems, and they wanted to try to help solve those problems, but it meant the giving up of power by the ruling class, the patricians, which the patricians were not interested in giving up that power. Rome fought 3 Punic Wars, and the word Punic means Carthaginian in Italian. So these were 3 wars fought against the city of Carthage. Carthage was actually a Phoenician settlement that had been founded a couple centuries before, and it had become one of the major world powers up to that point. The Phoenicians were probably originally from the Eastern Mediterranean, in the same area that the Philistines were part of, and they shared a lot of similar cultural religious beliefs and genetic makeup and things like that. So they actually practiced the worship of Baal, and that involved sacrifice of children. So the 3 Punic Wars were fought against this city that had ruled the western part of the Mediterranean for several centuries. The First Punic War, Rome won, and in the battle, Rome was called upon by the Sicilians, who were trying to guard against Carthaginian incursion, and they called upon Rome to come and help them save them from Carthage expanding its empire into their territory. So when Rome came to their rescue, it actually experienced a lot of defeat at first, because the Carthaginians were a sea-based power, and they knew a lot about sailing and about ships, and the Romans knew nothing about that. They were a land-based power. So when the Romans tried to attack the Carthaginians, they were very unsuccessful. But the thing that was in their favor was they were very persistent. They continued to work at becoming better on the ocean, and they were eventually successful in capturing several Carthaginian battleships, and they copied the plans and created their own battleships and learned how to man them in a matter of a year. So that's an incredible feat for for ancient technology, to be able to build a set of ships and man them and learn how to row them in unison, because that's how they did that. In this first Punic War, Rome won Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, the three major islands in the Western Mediterranean. In the Second Punic War, a man named Hannibal had come of age, and his father, who had also fought in the First Punic War, had initiated Hannibal with the one life passion of destroying Rome. So when Hannibal grew up, he, from an early age, was put into a position of power in the military because of his father's position, and he was sent to Spain at first, but his one purpose and one goal was to work his way around the southern part of Europe and through the Alps and down into Rome. And he took with him several fighting elephants from Africa. And so he's best known for crossing the Alps with a herd of war elephants. And for 15 years, he continued to fight battles along the Roman peninsula. But he never managed to confront Rome itself face to face. He was a great terror to the Romans, and they didn't know how to deal with his military capabilities. He was extremely intelligent and ruthless general. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, the Romans figured out a way to get him off of their peninsula. They sent a general to Hannibal's hometown, Carthage, and began attacking Carthage, and Carthage sent a distress letter to Hannibal calling him home to protect his own homeland. And so that brought Hannibal back, and in that in final battle for Carthage, Hannibal was he lost his prestige as being such an extraordinary general and fighter. In the Third Punic War, Carthage was destroyed completely, and I think this is because it was mainly because of revenge. Rome had suffered so many losses that they were ready to completely annihilate their enemy, and they did. In fact, they tore the city down piece by piece, not leaving one stone upon another. They often did this to their enemies that were annoying to them. They did this also to the Jews, the Jewish temple, later on in time. And they also took salt and they poured it over the land so that nothing would grow. The survivors of the city were either killed or sold into slavery. So it was a complete and utter destruction of Carthage. The Republic followed a policy of imperialism. Imperialism is the establishing of control over foreign lands and people. And Rome, one by one, conquered the different territories around their peninsula. So one of the first to go was Macedonia, the homeland of Alexander the Great. Also the rest of Greece and parts of Asia Minor became Roman provinces. Even Egypt allied herself with Rome. She wasn't completely under Roman control, but she was very much the inferior in her relationship with Rome. By 133 BC, the Romans referred to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. So they felt confident, and they had mastered the art of sailing, and they were ready to rule with power. With this power came some problems. It brought a lot of wealth, but it also brought a lot of unrest socially. There were new classes of people being created, a wealthy middle class with traders and officials and generals who had won battles and had won a lot of booty from their battles, and they were ready to invest in the good life. And so one of the values of the Romans is that a good Roman is a farmer, or is closely connected to the land. being a trader is not of high prestige in their eyes, but a gentleman farmer is probably the highest you could go. It was the ideal lifestyle. So these new wealthy, nouveau rich, would buy farming estates on the Italian peninsula, and these farming estates became known as latifundia. And they would use captured slaves as their farming labor. Those small farms that were also located on the Italian peninsula just could not compete with the slave labor and the size of these estates. And so a lot of these farmers gave up their farmland and they flocked to Rome looking for jobs, looking for ways to survive. And unfortunately, the job market was extremely competitive, mainly because there were just so many slaves. There was a glut of slaves in the Roman economy. This really caused a lot of urban unrest. There was a lot of corruption and conflict between the rich and the poor, and a complete loss of moral virtues or values within the Roman society. Many wanted to have things changed, and there were two brothers, the Gracchi brothers, spelled Gracchus, Gracchus brothers, were Tiberius and Gaius. Tiberius, the older, grew up, and he had actually fought as a young man, he had fought as a soldier in the last Punic War and helped to destroy that Punic, the Carthaginian city. And he later went on to become a political figure, and he used his position to help with reforming the government. But there were a lot of people who disagreed with him, especially the Senate, who did not want to give up any power, because his ideas of reform were to redistribute the land and to give the poor land, and this was hurting the rich right where it counted. So Tiberius Gracchus ran as tribune, and he managed to stay in power for a year, but usually tribunes were only allowed to have 1 year in office. But he broke precedent, and he ran for a second year, and this was a very scary thing for the Senate, and they eventually plotted his death. Well, 10 years later, in 123 BC, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, tried to do very similar reforms. He also ran for office as tribune, and his ideas followed his brothers. He also argued that the government should help give the poor a grain doles, or food for their daily needs. This was very expensive, and the Senate was unwilling to do this, and he also was murdered when the Senate hired thugs to set off waves of street riots, and he was accidentally killed, and his body was thrown into the Tiber full of stab wounds. This was like the worst outcome that you could have if you were killed, because Romans considered the funeral rites to be extremely important, and if your body was not cared for after death, it was a great shame to the family. So they were showing their displeasure with the Gracchus brothers.